The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the carrier Akagi, as Commander Mitsuo Fukuda watched his pilots prepare for what promised to be another crushing victory. It was June 4th, 1942, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had sailed halfway across the Pacific with 4 aircraft carriers and their escort vessels, confident that they would soon add Midway Atoll to their growing empire. For 6 months, Japanese forces had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami, capturing territory from Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies with barely a pause. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of his flagship, surveying the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled, the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. And here you formed the heart of his mobile force, their decks bristling with over 150 aircraft. These were the same ships and many of the same pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating effect on December 7, 1941. Since then, they had carved a path of destruction across the Pacific, sinking Allied warships and conquering strategic islands with methodical precision. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Nagumo's carriers would launch a devastating air strike against Midway's airfield and installations, neutralizing American air power on the tiny atoll. Meanwhile, Admiral Yamamoto Isaraku's main battle fleet, including the mighty battleship Yamato, would wait in reserve to engage and destroy the American Pacific Fleet. When it inevitably sailed to defend Midway, it was a trap that seemed foolproof, designed by Japan's most brilliant naval strategist. As dawn broke over the vast Pacific, the first wave of Japanese aircraft began launching from the 4 carriers. 108 planes, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters rose into the clear morning sky, their engines creating a thunderous symphony of power. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the formation toward Midway, confident that his pilots would repeat their previous successes. The Americans, they believed, would be caught completely off guard once again. But 300 miles to the northeast, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the carrier Enterprise was already aware of the Japanese approach, thanks to American codebreakers who had cracked the Japanese naval cipher. Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned his 3 carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown in the perfect position to ambush Nagumo's force. The Japanese believed they were the hunters, but they had become the hunted. The irony was not lost on those who understood the broader strategic picture. According to naval historian Gordon Prange's extensive research documented in Miracle at Midway, the Japanese had achieved tactical surprise at Pearl Harbor through careful planning and intelligence gathering, yet now found themselves victims of superior American intelligence work. The Americans knew not only that the Japanese were coming, but exactly when and where they would strike. As Tomonaga's bombers approached Midway, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. The Japanese had committed their most elite pilots and their most powerful ships to this operation, believing that victory was all but assured. They had no way of knowing that their enemy was not only prepared for their assault, but had positioned forces to deliver a counterstrike that would change the course of naval warfare forever. The rising sun that had illuminated Japanese conquests across the Pacific was about to reach its zenith and begin its descent into history. The first indication that this would not be another routine Japanese victory came at 0600 hours when Lieutenant Howard Ade's Catalina flying boat spotted the approaching enemy formation. Many planes heading Midway bearing 3-0 distance 150 crackled the radio message that sent American defenders scrambling to their battle stations. On Midway itself, Marine fighters and Army bombers prepared for what they knew would be a desperate defense against overwhelming odds. Aboard the Japanese carriers, the morning attack proceeded according to plan. Tomonaga's bombers struck Midway with devastating precision, setting fuel dumps ablaze and cratering the runway. But as the Japanese pilots circled overhead, they could see that the damage, while significant, had not completely neutralized the American base. More troubling were reports from reconnaissance aircraft of American naval forces somewhere to the northeast, ships that were not supposed to be there. According to Japanese intelligence estimates, Admiral Nagumo faced his first critical decision of the day. Tomonaga's radio message was clear: there is need for a second attack wave. The Japanese commander looked at his remaining aircraft spotted on the flight decks below, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes intended for use against American warships. If he ordered a second strike against Midway, these weapons would need to be replaced with general-purpose bombs suitable for attacking land targets, a process that would take precious time and leave his carriers vulnerable. The decision became more urgent when at 7:28, the cruiser Tone's reconnaissance aircraft finally reported what Nagumo had dreaded. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships in position bearing 10 degrees distance, 240 miles from Midway. The report was maddeningly vague. Were these warships or merely transports? Most critically, did the American force include aircraft carriers? Meanwhile, Admiral Spruance had already made his decision. Despite being outranged by Japanese aircraft, he ordered his pilots to launch immediately while the enemy was distracted by operations against Midway. Launch the attack, came the order at 0700 hours. Within minutes, the decks of Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown erupted in controlled chaos as flight crews prepared over 100 aircraft for the most important mission of their lives. The American strike force that rose from the three carriers represented everything the United States Navy could muster in the Central Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 dive bombers from Enterprise, while Lieutenant Commander John Waldron commanded 15 torpedo bombers from Hornet. These were not the seasoned veterans who had struck Pearl Harbor, but rather young Americans who had trained for months in the desperate period following that surprise attack. As the American formations flew westward toward their targets, Nagumo's dilemma intensified. At 0830, Tone's scout finally provided the critical intelligence: enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier. The news struck the Japanese command like a thunderbolt. Not only were American carriers present, but they were close enough to pose an immediate threat. Nagumo's response revealed the first cracks in Japanese naval doctrine that had seemed invincible for 6 months. He ordered his crews to stop rearming aircraft with land attack weapons and begin the complex process of switching back to anti-ship armaments. Bombs and torpedoes were hastily moved in and out of storage magazines while fuel lines snaked across flight decks already crowded with aircraft. The carriers that had seemed so perfectly organized just hours before now resembled floating ammunition dumps. The morning sun climbed higher as both forces raced toward their fateful encounter. The Japanese, despite their confusion over American intentions, still possessed overwhelming advantages in aircraft numbers, pilot experience, and ship firepower. Their carriers had never suffered a serious defeat, and their pilots had accumulated combat experience across the Pacific. But as Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's dive bombers continued their search for the enemy fleet, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just courage and skill, but the fundamental assumptions about naval warfare that both sides had carried into battle. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron gathered his 15 torpedo bomber crews around him on the flight deck of Hornet as engines warmed up in the pre-dawn darkness. His weathered face, marked by years of naval service, showed no emotion as he delivered what many would later recognize as a prophetic briefing. "We're going in against the Japanese fleet," he told his young aviators, many of whom had never seen combat. "We'll probably catch hell, but we're going to get some hits." His squadron, Torpedo 8, was about to write one of the most heroic and tragic chapters in naval aviation history. By 0900 hours, the first American attack waves were airborne and heading toward the estimated position of Nagumo's mobile force. The plan called for coordinated strikes by dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters, but the reality of Pacific combat quickly shattered such neat tactical arrangements. Radio communication proved sporadic. Navigation over the featureless ocean challenged even experienced pilots, and the sheer distances involved meant that timing would be more a matter of luck than precise coordination. Waldron's torpedo bombers were the first to locate the Japanese fleet, flying low over the waves to avoid radar detection. They spotted the distinctive pagoda-like superstructures of Japanese warships at 0930, but what they found was far more formidable than intelligence estimates had suggested. For Aircraft carriers steamed in formation, surrounded by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that bristled with anti-aircraft guns. Worse still, the Japanese had launched their own strike aircraft and were in the process of recovering the Midway attack force, meaning their decks were crowded with fueled and armed planes. The attack that followed demonstrated both the courage of American naval aviators and the deadly effectiveness of Japanese air defenses. Waldron led his squadron in a low-level approach against the carrier Soryu, his obsolete Devastator torpedo. Bombers flying straight into a wall of anti-aircraft fire. Zero fighters dove from above like attacking hawks, their 20mm cannons ripping through the slow, vulnerable American aircraft. One by one, Waldron's planes fell into the Pacific, their crews lost beneath the waves. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo 8, watched from his life raft as the drama continued to unfold around him. His account, later documented in numerous Pacific War histories, provided a unique perspective on the battle's most critical moments. He saw Waldron's plane explode in flames, witnessed the systematic destruction of his squadron mates, and then observed something that would change the course of the war. Japanese fighters being drawn down to sea level by the torpedo attacks, leaving the upper altitudes undefended. The sacrifice of Torpedo 8 and the similar fates that befell torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown served a crucial strategic purpose that became apparent only later. By attacking at wavetop height, these brave airmen forced Japanese combat air patrol fighters to descend from their normal high-altitude stations, the Zeros, low on fuel and ammunition after engaging the torpedo bombers, were caught out of position when the real hammer blow arrived from above dot at 10:30. As Japanese flight deck crews continued the dangerous process of rearming and refueling aircraft for strikes against the American carriers, Admiral Nagumo faced another crisis. His own attack aircraft were returning from Midway, damaged and low on fuel, demanding immediate recovery. The Admiral made a fateful decision: complete the rearming process and recover his returning aircraft before launching strikes against the American fleet. It was a logical choice based on standard naval doctrine, but it left his carriers in their most vulnerable state. The irony of the moment was lost on participants, but would later be analyzed extensively by military historians. The Japanese, who had perfected the art of carrier operations through years of training and combat experience, found themselves trapped by their own expertise. Their flight decks, normally models of organized efficiency, had become floating fire hazards as aviation gasoline, bombs, and torpedoes were shuttled about in preparation for operations that would never come. As the morning wore on, both forces remained locked in their deadly embrace. The Americans had suffered devastating losses in their initial attacks, with entire squadrons wiped out and seemingly little to show for their sacrifice. The Japanese appeared to have weathered the storm, their carriers still operational and their aircraft still deadly. But beneath the surface of apparent Japanese success, the battle's decisive moment was approaching, carried forward by dive bombers that had not yet found their targets, but were searching with the determination of hunters who knew their prey was near. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey banked his dauntless dive bomber in a wide search pattern, his fuel gauge showing dangerously low levels as he scanned the empty Pacific below. His 37 aircraft from Enterprise had been airborne for over 2 hours, following compass headings that should have led them to the Japanese fleet. But the ocean remained frustratingly empty, broken only by whitecaps and the occasional cloud shadow. McCluskey faced the agonizing decision that had claimed many Pacific aviators: continue searching and risk running out of fuel, or turn back with his mission unfulfilled. At precisely 10:22, McCluskey's persistence paid off in the most spectacular fashion. A single Japanese destroyer, racing northward at high speed, appeared below his formation like a signpost pointing toward destiny. The Arashi had been left behind after depth charging the American submarine Nautilus, and now it was inadvertently leading the American dive bombers directly to Nagumo's carriers. McCluskey followed the destroyer's wake, and within minutes the entire Japanese mobile force spread out below him like ships in a peaceful harbor. What McCluskey saw defied his most optimistic expectations. For aircraft carriers steamed in formation, their flight decks crowded with planes being refueled and rearmed. Fuel lines snaked across the wooden decks while ordnance crews wheeled bombs and torpedoes into position. The carriers were caught in the most vulnerable moment of naval operations, the brief period when ships transform from defensive platforms into floating ammunition depots. It was a target of opportunity that no dive bomber pilot could have imagined in his wildest dreams. The Japanese fleet had no idea death was approaching from 17,000 feet above. Their combat air patrol had been drawn down to sea level by the earlier torpedo attacks, and radar operators were focused on surface threats rather than high-altitude aircraft. Lookouts who might have spotted the American dive bombers were distracted by the complex ballet of flight operations taking place on their own decks. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese carriers were about to experience what their victims had endured 6 months earlier. Complete surprise from the skies. McCluskey's attack perfectly embodied the tactical doctrine developed by American naval aviators during the desperate months following Pearl Harbor. His dive bombers split into 2 groups, with 17 aircraft targeting the carrier Kaga while the remaining 20 went after Akagi. The approach was textbook perfect, a steep dive from high altitude that would bring the bombers through anti-aircraft fire in mere seconds while delivering 1,000-pound bombs with devastating accuracy. Lieutenant Richard Best led the attack on Akagi, Nagumo's flagship and the symbol of Japanese naval power in the Pacific. As his Dauntless screamed downward through the thin morning air, Best could see Japanese sailors running across the flight deck below, suddenly aware of the danger plummeting toward them. Anti-aircraft guns began firing desperately, but the geometry of dive bombing favored the attackers. By the time gunners could track the diving aircraft, the bombs were already falling toward their targets. The first bomb struck Akagi amidships at 10:26, penetrating the flight deck and exploding among aircraft being prepared for launch. The detonation ignited aviation gasoline and triggered sympathetic explosions in bomb and torpedo magazines. Within seconds, the carrier that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor was transformed into a floating inferno. Admiral Nagumo, standing on the bridge, watched in stunned disbelief as his flagship became a death trap of fire and exploding ordnance. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher's dive bombers were visiting similar destruction upon Kaga. Multiple bomb hits turned the carrier into a raging funeral pyre, her flight deck collapsing into the hangar spaces below, where fueled aircraft created additional explosions. The carrier that had helped establish Japanese air superiority across the Pacific was now settling by the bow, her crew abandoning ship as flames reached toward the sky like grasping fingers. According to naval historian Walter Lord's meticulously researched account, an incredible victory. These 5 minutes from 10:22 to 10:27 represented one of the most decisive moments in naval warfare history. 2 of Japan's most experienced aircraft carriers, along with their irreplaceable pilots and aircraft, were effectively destroyed in less time than it took to launch a single strike mission. The strategic balance in the Pacific, which had favored Japan since Pearl Harbor, shifted permanently in those brief moments above the blue waters of the Central Pacific. But the morning's drama was far from over. Even as Akagi and Kaga burned, the remaining Japanese carriers Soryu and Hiryu continued operations, their crews working frantically to launch retaliatory strikes against the American fleet. The battle that had begun with Japanese confidence in easy victory was transforming into a desperate struggle for survival, with both sides now fully committed to a fight that would determine the future course of the Pacific War. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto stood on the bridge of Soryu as the third wave of American dive bombers appeared in the sky above his carrier. The morning had already brought disaster beyond his worst nightmares. Akagi and Kaga were burning wrecks, their flight decks collapsed, and their crews abandoning ship. Now Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bombers from Yorktown were screaming down toward Soryu with the same deadly precision that had destroyed the other 2 carriers. Yanagimoto gripped the bridge railing and prepared to share the fate of his fellow captains. The attack on Soryu unfolded with mechanical precision. that spoke to the intensive training American naval aviators had undergone since Pearl Harbor. Leslie's Dauntlesses dove through scattered clouds at 60-degree angles, their Curtiss electric propellers howling as they built up speed in the thin air. The first 1,000-pound bomb struck Soyuz flight deck at 10:25, penetrating to the hangar level where it detonated among 18 fully fueled Kate torpedo bombers. The explosion sent a pillar of orange flame shooting through the flight deck, followed immediately by 2 more direct hits that turned the carrier into a floating volcano. Within minutes, Soyuz was engulfed in flames that made rescue operations impossible. Aviation gasoline-fed fires that reached temperatures capable of melting steel, while exploding ordnance sent debris flying hundreds of feet into the air. Captain Yanagimoto, following the ancient tradition of Bushido, chose to go down with his ship rather than face the shame of survival. His sacrifice symbolized the broader tragedy befalling the Japanese Navy. Experienced officers and irreplaceable pilots were perishing along with their ships in a disaster that would cripple Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of the war. The destruction of 3 carriers in less than 10 minutes represented more than tactical defeat. It marked the collapse of Japanese naval supremacy that had seemed absolute since the attack on Pearl Harbor. The mobile force that had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tide was now reduced to a single operational carrier, Hiryu, commanded by Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi. As smoke pillars from the burning carriers rose like funeral pyres against the blue Pacific sky, Yamaguchi realized that only immediate and decisive action could salvage anything from the catastrophe. Yamaguchi's response demonstrated the fighting spirit that had carried Japanese forces to victory across the Pacific. Despite being outnumbered and isolated, he ordered Hiryu to launch every available aircraft against the American fleet. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters toward the last known position of the enemy carriers, determined to extract some measure of revenge for the morning's disasters. It was a desperate gamble, but Yamaguchi understood that Hiryu's survival depended on striking the Americans before they could organize another coordinated attack. The Japanese counter-strike found its target in Yorktown, the veteran carrier that had survived the Coral Sea battle despite significant damage. At noon, Kobayashi's dive bombers penetrated the American Combat Air Patrol and scored 3 direct hits on Yorktown's flight deck. The explosions killed dozens of American sailors and started fires that threatened the ship's aviation gasoline storage areas. For a brief moment, it appeared that Japanese naval aviation might still demonstrate its legendary effectiveness, even in defeat, but the damage to Yorktown, while serious, paled in comparison to the destruction visited upon 3 Japanese carriers. American damage control techniques, perfected through bitter experience in the early months of the war, quickly brought the fires under control. Within 2 hours, Yorktown was recovering aircraft and preparing to resume flight operations. The contrast with Japanese damage control capabilities was stark, where American carriers could absorb significant punishment and continue fighting. Japanese carriers proved devastatingly vulnerable to sustained damage. The afternoon brought a second Japanese strike from Hiryu, this time led by Lieutenant Tomonaga, who had returned from the morning attack on Midway. His 10 torpedo bombers, escorted by 6 fighters, attacked Yorktown just as the carrier was resuming operations. 2 torpedo hits brought flooding that caused a severe list, forcing the abandonment of the ship that had fought so valiantly throughout the morning. But even this success could not alter the fundamental reality that Japan had lost 3/4 of its elite carrier force in a single morning. As documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive history of United States naval operations in World War II, the Battle of Midway's first day represented a complete reversal of the strategic situation that had existed since Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Navy, which had seemed invincible in its sweep across the Pacific, had suffered losses that would require years to replace if they could be replaced at all. The experienced pilots who went down with Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu represented an investment in training and combat experience that Japan's shrinking resources could not duplicate. The sun that had risen on Japanese confidence now illuminated a scene of devastation that marked the beginning of the end for the Imperial Navy's Pacific ambitions. But the battle was not yet over, and Hiryu still floated defiantly in the gathering afternoon, her crew preparing for one final confrontation that would determine whether any part of Nagumo's mobile force would survive to see another dawn. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stood on Hiryu's bridge as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of his doomed carrier. Round him, the Pacific Ocean bore witness to one of naval warfare's greatest disasters. 3 Japanese carriers burned as funeral pyres, their smoke columns visible for 50 miles in every direction. Yamaguchi, a graduate of Princeton University and one of Japan's most progressive naval officers, understood better than most the strategic implications of the morning's catastrophe. Yet he also embodied the fighting spirit of the Imperial Navy, and he was determined that Hiryu would not die quietly. The irony of Yamaguchi's situation would have been apparent to students of naval history. Here was an officer who had studied American industrial capacity firsthand, who understood the mathematical impossibility of Japan's long-term victory against the United States, yet who was now committed to fighting to the death rather than surrender. His decision to continue operations with a single carrier against 3 American flat-tops represented both the nobility and the futility of the samurai tradition applied to modern warfare. At 14:30 hours, Yamaguchi received the news he had been dreading. American dive bombers were approaching Hiryu from the northeast. Enterprise had launched 24 Dauntless aircraft under Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, the same pilot who had helped destroy Kaga earlier in the day. The Americans were returning to finish what they had started at dawn, and this time there would be no Japanese fighters at altitude to provide even token opposition. Hiryu's combat air patrol had been decimated in the earlier strikes against Yorktown, leaving the carrier essentially defenseless against high-altitude attack. The final attack on Hiryu unfolded with the same devastating precision that had characterized American dive bombing. Throughout the day, Gallagher's Dauntlesses dove through scattered clouds at 1700 hours, their bombs aimed at the last operational Japanese carrier in the Central Pacific. The first 1,000-pound bomb struck Hiryu's flight deck forward of the island, penetrating to the hangar where it ignited aviation gasoline and armed aircraft. 3 more direct hits followed in rapid succession, each explosion adding to the inferno that was consuming Japan's naval aviation from within. Captain Tomio Kaku, Hiryu's commanding officer, faced the same impossible choice that had confronted his fellow captains throughout the day. The carrier was clearly doomed. Her flight deck collapsed and her hangar spaces filled with fire that no damage control team could contain. Unlike American carriers, which were designed with extensive compartmentalization and sophisticated fire suppression systems, Japanese carriers proved fatally vulnerable to sustained damage. The emphasis on offensive capability that had served the Imperial Navy so well in the war's early months now contributed to their destruction. As Hiryu settled deeper into the Pacific swells, her list increasing with each passing hour, Yamaguchi made a decision that reflected both personal honor and strategic reality. Rather than attempt escape in the gathering darkness, he chose to remain aboard his flagship and share the fate of his men. His final radio message to Admiral Yamamoto was characteristic of the man. "I am prepared to crash dive my plane into an enemy carrier, but I cannot locate the enemy." It was the last transmission from Nagumo's mobile force, the final words of a naval formation that had seemed invincible just 12 hours earlier. The destruction of Hiryu marked more than the end of a single battle. It represented the collapse of Japanese naval aviation as an offensive force in the Pacific War. The 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and terrorized Allied shipping across the Pacific were now settling beneath the waves, taking with them hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and thousands of experienced sailors. The Japanese Navy would continue to fight for 3 more years, but it would never again possess the capability to project decisive power across the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship, Yamato 300 miles to the west, received the final damage reports with stoic resignation. The man who had warned his government that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year against the United States now saw his prediction coming to pass with mathematical precision. The mobile force that had been the spearhead of Japanese expansion was destroyed, and with it died any realistic hope of achieving the decisive victory that might have forced America to negotiate a compromise peace. As darkness fell over the Central Pacific on June 4, 1942, the strategic balance of the Pacific War had shifted permanently. The battle that began with Japanese confidence in easy victory had ended with the destruction of Japan's most elite naval formation. For aircraft carriers, over 150 aircraft and more than 3,000 experienced naval personnel were lost in a single day of combat. It was a defeat from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover, and the beginning of an American offensive that would carry across the Pacific to the shores of Japan itself. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in his headquarters at Pearl Harbor as the first complete battle reports arrived from the Central Pacific. The numbers seemed almost too extraordinary to believe, for Japanese aircraft carriers sunk, over 100 enemy aircraft destroyed, and Japan's most experienced naval aviation units effectively eliminated as fighting forces. The quiet admiral, who had inherited command of the Pacific Fleet after its devastation 6 months earlier, now found himself architect of the most decisive naval victory in American history. The strategic implications of Midway's outcome extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's naval aviation had required years to develop, with pilots trained to standards that demanded thousands of flying hours and combat experience that could not be quickly replaced. The loss of these replaceable airmen, combined with the destruction of fleet carriers, meant that the Imperial Japanese Navy would never again possess the capability to launch major offensive operations across the Pacific's vast distances. The initiative that Japan had seized at Pearl Harbor was now permanently lost. Emperor Hirohito received the news of Midway's disaster in his private study at the Imperial Palace, his normally impassive features betraying no emotion as he absorbed the magnitude of the defeat. The emperor, who had been reluctantly drawn into war by his military advisors' promises of quick victory, now understood that Japan faced a prolonged conflict against an industrial power whose capacity for producing ships and aircraft dwarfed his nation's capabilities. The divine wind that had protected Japan from foreign invasion for 7 centuries had failed to shield the modern Imperial Navy from American dive bombers. The human cost of Midway's failure extended beyond military casualties to encompass Japan's entire strategic position in the Pacific War. The carrier-based aircraft that had established Japanese air superiority from Pearl Harbor to Darwin were now resting on the ocean floor, along with the pilots who had made them so effective. Training new aviators would require months that Japan could not spare, while building replacement carriers would demand industrial resources that were already stretched to their limits by the requirements of a global war. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose decision to follow a single destroyer had led to the most decisive moment of the battle, found himself suddenly famous as newspapers across America celebrated the victory at Midway. But McCluskey, like many combat veterans, understood that individual heroism had been less important than systematic preparation and superior intelligence. The victory belonged not to any single pilot or commander, but to the collective effort of codebreakers, intelligence analysts, and strategic planners who had positioned American forces for maximum effectiveness against an overconfident enemy. The Battle of Midway's conclusion marked the end of Japan's period of unchallenged expansion and the beginning of a defensive struggle that would ultimately prove futile. According to wartime analysis conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, Japan's industrial capacity could never match American production levels, particularly in the complex field of naval aviation. The carriers and aircraft lost at Midway represented assets that required years to develop but could be destroyed in minutes by properly coordinated attacks. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and the principal advocate for the Midway operation, privately acknowledged that Japan's last realistic chance for negotiated peace had died with the mobile force. His prediction that Japan could run wild for 6 months had proven accurate to within days. Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor and marked the precise moment when American industrial and technological advantages began to assert themselves decisively in the Pacific theater. The sunset of June 4, 1942, illuminated not just the wreckage of for Japanese aircraft carriers, but the end of an era in naval warfare. The age of the battleship, which had dominated naval thinking for generations, had been definitively replaced by the age of naval aviation. But even more significantly, the Battle of Midway demonstrated that superior technology and industrial capacity, properly applied through competent leadership and accurate intelligence, could overcome initial tactical advantages and experienced personnel. As Admiral Spruance's task force turned eastward toward Pearl Harbor, carrying with it the most decisive victory in American naval history, the strategic balance of the Pacific War had been permanently altered. Japan's empire, which had seemed to stretch inexorably across the Pacific like a rising tide, had reached its high water mark and begun the long retreat that would end 3 years later in Tokyo Bay. The dive bombers that had plunged from the morning sky above Nagumo's carriers had not merely sunk ships, they had changed the course of history and ensured that the sun would indeed set on the empire of the rising sun.